Hello, good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to this webinar. I am Anna Sorensen. I am a physicist and researcher at the National Council for in Argentina for Technology and Science. I'm also the expert focal point, and we are now, together with Julieta, organizing this webinar. For those of you who are perhaps not organized or familiar with the program, this is a world program for climate research. My matrix has one objective, and that is to develop and integrate in climate sciences all the work that we're doing from the bottom up, which will affect regions, and as a part of the context will allow us to introduce all the information, all the climate and meteo information that we need. This initiative, My Climate Risk, has been organized as a series of regional hubs, like practical communities, each working in their specific communities, but sharing know-how and resources so that we can reach the same goal. As you can see in the map on your screen, we have 14 hubs worldwide, but only one in Latin America. This could change if more Latin American groups adhere to this community. In the case of our regional hub in Argentina, this is a team of 20 students, PhD students, researchers from various disciplines, and we all work together on different projects to share know-how with the communities. For a year now, we have been meeting regularly in the context of My Climate Risk to get a common knowledge as an interdisciplinary team as to what we understand are the basic consequences and aspects of My Climate Risk. Julieta, please go ahead. Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm Julieta Canavas. I'm a social anthropologist, and together with Anna, I will be moderating our webinar today, which is entitled, How Do We Address Climate Risk? This is the first webinar of a cycle that we will be holding, organized by Argentina, and we want to call it Actionable Climate Knowledge for All. Within this cycle of webinars, in addition to the presentation today, in July, we will be hearing about narrative on climate. In August, we will be discussing multiple audiences and how to reach audiences. And finally, in September, co-production of knowledge. Of course, you are very cordially invited to attend these future webinars and to get all the up-to-date knowledge and information that we are developing. So if you want to follow us, you can subscribe on our website. Now, the webinar today is broaching a very important topic on climate change studies, as is the risk. We'll be hearing a number of presentations based on research carried out in Argentina from different disciplinary perspectives. Today, we're going to be discussing relevant knowledge that can be integrated in decision-making regarding risks in a context of climate change. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat box of our that you can see at the bottom of your screen. We will be answering all your questions once the presentations have been delivered, and we are very grateful once again for your participation in the webinar today. And now, to kick off, I'm going to give the floor to Sol Hurtado. She has a degree in anthropological sciences by the Buenos Aires University. She is a PhD student in social anthropology, globalization, and so on at the social studies, high social studies at the University of San Martin. You have the floor. Thank you, Julieta, very much. Thank you, Anna. And good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Just give me a couple of seconds so that I can share my screen. You can see my presentation now on your screens? Yes, we can. Thank you. Please go ahead. Thank you. So my presentation today is going to give you a panoramic bird's eye view, very quickly, a very superficial bird's eye view of multiple layers, if you like, of analyses that we have carried out on the disaster response to risk management. I'm going to give you a very brief summary of some of the work, some of the authors, some of the theories that are central in how we understand risk and risk management from the social perspective. Then I will try to also explain, also very superficially, how all of this will have an impact on the global actions that will be carried out under the UN framework. And later, I will also be presenting very briefly some of the results of my PhD studies in social anthropology. What you can see on your screens right now is a drawing from Darío Clarín, a famous humorist in Argentina, who somehow tries to portray this concept from the German sociologist Ulrich Beck. What is the society of risk? So this author, Ulrich Beck, basically advocates that we can think about the contemporary world as a world of risk. What he advocates is that this society is superimposed over the society based on classes and the Industrial Revolution. And now risks are a result, are an undesired risk of the progress of the industrial machinery, and it is intrinsically linked to this. So permanently, new risks are created which transcend political boundaries while having local implications which are differentiated. Climate change is a very clear example of this creation of global risks which have very, very clear, distinct local impacts. These new risks for humanity are being produced scientifically, but so to understand them, we need to understand what the experts say. And this implies what the author calls the cognitive imperative by the major part of the population. So the conditions of production of scientific knowledge may, in fact, become a factor for inequality. In the next two slides, I'm going to be presenting some of the ideas that we have developed from my group in terms of preventing risks in Latin America. This is a network of scientists which was created years ago, and we have been producing knowledge since the 1990s regarding disaster risks from the perspective of history, geography, anthropology. Now, studies on risk do represent an institutional endeavor to try to diminish the unpredictable. We could say that the risk can be explained as a calculation of odds of how a phenomenon which threatened us might occur and might create a potential harm and damage to a population which we label as vulnerable in terms of that risk. Now, the processes and social relations distribute this risk in an unequal manner, creating more vulnerability in the face of threats. And this has nothing to do with social and material existence, but more with the conditions to prepare and mitigate the risk as a function of how this risk is understood and represented. The risk is increasing and cumulative in time, so therefore it requires long-term analysis. Now, how are the various risks represented and perceived socially? Well, this depends on the context. They are relative in social and cultural terms, and they are defined as a function of tolerable life situations or conditions of living. But also power comes into force. The anthropologist Mary Anglis talks about acceptability, or how do we accept risk? How do communities accept risk or certain risks in terms of how they are perceived, represented, and understood socially? From this point of view, therefore, risk is not a material objective focus, but rather a social construct which has been created and disseminated. Now, this way of understanding risk implies a different way of understanding what we have now have been calling natural disasters, at least until a few years ago. We have to change the focus on the response and management of the disaster towards the management of the risk of disaster. The great contribution of this paradigm really is based on incorporating social dynamics as an active part of risk. So we shouldn't see risk anymore as isolated, unpredictable events caused by exogenous factors that do not affect society, but rather to think of them as a result of social and natural processes, as a consequence of pre-existing conditions. There is no other way to prepare ahead of time, because we used to think of risk and disasters as an isolated phenomenon. This change is also seen in the global framework actions for the United Nations and other institutions under the UN globally, as from the 2005 framework and the Zendai framework in 2015. There has been recommendations about changing this paradigm in terms of protecting societies. Some of the aspects that have been brought on board clearly reflect the change of paradigm. For example, the focus on pre-existing threats, disasters seen as a part of a cycle, and also adaptation to climate change. But these frameworks for action, they are global in nature indeed, but they're not specific enough, and they do not propose clear paths of action, because they simply show recommendations without a context, which are difficult to apply everywhere around the world. So these recommendations are very generic. They have been adopted by all the states in United Nations and also in Argentina. Current legislation has been incorporating the various categories of paradigms, but without the actual causes that trigger them. In the regulatory frameworks in different states, this change of paradigm has impregnated how we approach management of disasters. But we clearly see that those regulations and legislation are not sufficient or appropriate to face the threat. Now, a very quick reference to my own research. I'm going to give you two cases. I can give you more details during the debate, but I won't extend this further. Very briefly, between 2016 and 2019, under the direction of our anthropologist, Valeria Hernandez, I carried out an ethnographic research on two levels in Argentina, one on a provincial level, another on municipal level, within an interdisciplinary project directed by Dr. Carolina Vera, climatologist. Now, in the study, we were able to understand how this change of paradigm is basically taken upon by the various institutions who deal with disaster risk and management. We were able to understand how this transition takes place, not in a linear form or in a homogeneous form, and how climate and meteo information is one very important channel for this transformation. As a result of my research, and thanks to dialogue, exchanging know-how and reflections with the entire interdisciplinary team, we were able to identify a very important gap between the mandates in the action mandates, which have been incorporated into national law, and the day-to-day conditions of work of those who work on trying to implement those policies. Now, to wrap up my intervention, I wanted to present to you some of the local challenges that we were able to identify in terms of the change of paradigm. The change of paradigm for local municipalities who have to implement these policies represents the following. One key challenge is the cross-cutting nature of the paradigm of how to manage disaster risk. Then, in terms of responding to the disaster and managing the risk, we also see another challenge. We need a cross-cutting, integral approach, holistic approach, to try to broaden this in terms of time, space, and also concepts of our understanding. So the criteria for intervention that might actually trigger an emergency or a disaster.
So we wonder whether it's civil protection who needs to be taking the lead in disaster prevention. And to this aspect, there's yet another layer of complexity. In Argentina, we are organized in a federal level. The federalism that applies in Argentina defines jurisdictional competencies, but not public policies. So, in the way in which the country, the nation, can have an impact on provincial policies, and the way the provinces can have an influence in local policies is actually by advocating, doing advocacy. So, because each local level generates its own regulations, and that generates a whole host of different scenarios. There's yet another element here. It's the paradigm shift and what the climate change context means in order to have the expertise that we need to respond to these new specificities. In particular, the having climate and weather information requires the development of cognitive, practical, institutional skills that are different to the ones that are usually the domain of civil protection or civil defense services. That's already a challenge for the local and provincial levels. And then finally, the bottom-up approach has yet another challenge. It's the need to make it systematic and visible the operational and territorial knowledge of in the different bodies and agencies that have to implement these policies. In this case, civil protection. For the prevention of disaster risk, it is essential that the knowledge that is constantly generated is always taken into account, and both the scientific literature and the international guidelines on the issue. Well, that's all from me, and now I'm giving back the floor for the next speakers, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions you have for me later on. Well, thank you very much, Saul. So you have any questions or comments for Saul, please write them down in the chat or in the Q&A section, and then we will move on. Now we'll move on to Juan's presentation, then we will take all the questions together. So we have Juan. He is he's also a researcher, and he works for the Argentinian Social Sciences Institute. Well, good morning and afternoon to everyone. Well, I'm very happy to be able to take part in this My Climate Risk Initiative from the Argentinian Hub. And in this case, I'll try and give you some brief examples on how risk also offers us some opportunities to have to do some advocacy in the Mendoza province in Argentina. And I'll be able to let you know what's happening there in this particular region regarding drought and water shortages. So you have here one of the rivers in the province of San Luis. This is in the picture, you can see a clear example of what is actually happening in the region. So first of all, I'd like to introduce to you the concept of risk, according to the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. As a result, risk is the result of three factors: threats on one side, which is coming from the climate aspects, the natural variability of climate, and as well as anthropogenic changes generated by human activities, exposure, and vulnerability. The three elements, these are a response to economic processes. The GHG emissions, for instance, are also reinforcing this climate variability that also has a bearing on threats and hazards and dangers. And we will also have impacts from all of these factors. And one of those threats or dangers can be the heat waves, for instance. Then an example of vulnerability could be a problem with cooling systems. Living in an area where you don't have access to cooling services, or you cannot really face a heat wave because you don't have the means to cool your house down. And then it's already, as I already mentioned, it's exposure. Living in urban areas, heat waves in urban areas, well, the urban islands are also making heat waves stronger, more strongly felt, which also has an impact associated to it. And then, in particular, this diagram that comes from an assessment made by the IPCC, and if we take a look at the six reports, see there are some plus signs, some arrows there. Why is that so? Because climate risks, or dangers, or hazards, do not act in isolation. They tend to overlap. For instance, these heat waves can be overlapping with an existing drought, and this will in turn increase the risk. And these arrows show us how the dangers, the vulnerabilities change. We can also think of different new vulnerabilities, new vulnerable situations. So the climate system does not act in isolation in a linear manner, and the dangers or risks associated to climate don't act in isolation either, and the response is not linear either. So this is something that we need to take into account when we think of the risks, exposures, and vulnerabilities. So let me tell you about one of the dangers and one of the risks that we have in Western Argentina. For those who are not familiar with the region, let me show you uh, where are we located. So we are just at the border with Chile. We have the Andean mountains, some of the main rivers in the region, and for the most part, water in the region, the water that we need to develop the most important economic activities is associated to the rivers, the river, um, the water flowing from the rivers coming from the Andes Ridge, and so we have what we call productive oasis, where the mm, vast majority of socioeconomic activities in the region are carried out. Irrigation is uh, is key, coming from these surface water resources from the major rivers in the region. But we need to bear in mind in the last 12 years, there's been a reduction in the snowfall, the snow layer in the mountains in the area. So that not only affected winter tourism, but also the use of the levels of water available for domestic and industrial and agricultural use. So here you can see the image of one of the most important reservoirs at the northern part in the region of Mendoza, where water levels were extremely low. And these images come from were taken last June. So how can we quantify this hydrological or water drought? It is the lack of water, scarcity of water in the hydrological system. That is, and the result is particularly low water flow in the rivers and in lakes, reservoirs, and underground water. So that's the way we can quantify the occurrence of these phenomenon. So levels in aquifers, the water surface in wetlands, and the water volume in reservoirs. So we can calculate those by using certain parameters and thresholds that allow us to identify hydrological drought. So here we have a clear example of well, the origin, the root cause of this hydrological drought, the lack of snow. Of, so we can see that there is virtually no snow. So that snow that should have been accumulated during the winter um, and would have been feeding the most important rivers in the region. Well, given the lack of snow, the glaciers and the rivers start having less and less volume, because not only because of the lack of water, but also because of the increase in temperatures, more evaporation, and so you can see the final result. So this lack of snowfall has been lasting for several years now, and it's extremely important to take this into account because this deficit has an incredible impact on the whole hydrological cycle in the region. So let me focus here a bit on these prolonged drought that we have been studying in the region in the last few years. So out of the climate variability, we can define meteorology or meteorological or weather drought. This is identified in the anomaly, the anomalous lack of snow during winter. So you can see the bars with negative values from 2010 onwards. So this is the time and this period where we have had a deficit in the last few years that has been generated because of this weather drought or meteorological drought. So this lack of snowfall. Now, the spread of that deficit signal or deficit sign is well, it is spread in different levels in the atmosphere, in the soil, and also in the different components of the water cycle that lead us to this hydrological drought. And so you can see the number of basins with deficits in the rivers. So from 2010 onwards, you can see the different, this is a severity scale indicated by a color codes. So you can see where we have hydrological drought, and the colors tell us about the severity levels. So until 2021, from 2010, there was a large proportion of these basins with an extreme deficit. And this only taken a look at the surface water flows. But there was also yet another layer to be taken into account, which is the lagoons or lakes. These are the lagoons at Guanacache. So for 2 years in particular, 87, 88, we started to look into of October 87 until March 88. So all that snow melted and fed the different water bodies in the region. You can see the difference in the area, in the surface area of these lagoons in the last few years. So this is also a sign of hydrological drought. There's yet another example, the Yancanela Lagoon in the south of the Mendoza province. So you can see this image from 1988 and the contrast with the image in December 2016. There's a major reduction in these bodies of water. And lastly, we have the ecological impact. For instance, look at the death of fish and the pink flamingos here that are bird populations that nest along these bodies of water. Well, they have also been impacted in this regard. So we not only have to consider these climate risks in terms of financial impact or socio-economic impact, but also we need to focus on the ecological impact, environmental impact as well. And here, if we then there are human activities that also make these changes stronger. For instance, land use, irrigation, this fragmentation of the region that we mentioned earlier. Everything is distributed, and water resources are mostly used in small oases. And so there is a fragmentation in the use of water. There's also some dams and some reservoirs have been built to help production in these areas. So these production oases and the dams that have been built are located in the mid to high parts of rivers. If we consider I mean, this is upstream mostly. So if we think in the downstream areas, that's where the wetlands are located, well, those downstream areas are very much suffering the deficit and the water deficit with the relevant and corresponding environmental impact. For instance, this is the Penitentes ski resort, one of the most important in the region. You can see that this is an image from last year. Well, there is a very, very little snow cover there. And that's just one of the impacts for that's winter tourism, but there are many, many other impacts. So let's not, I mean, let's not think that this is the only climate risk that we need to think about. There are many others. We have quantified the threat and risk for all the different basins. We know that vulnerability is very high because these oases um, represent 5% of the whole territory here, but 95% of the water resources are used there. So the risk is huge. And this, so let's not only think about the financial risk, as I said, but also the ecological risk. This is the risk for intense rainfall, for instance. And in the urban areas in the Mendoza region, we have the Zonda wind. So the wind is a weather phenomenon that generates heat wave in a very short lapse of time. So we have a weather station that is showing 24.5 degrees Celsius, whereas there is another 17.3. Look at the wind speeds, 41.3 kilometers per hour and almost no wind there. So there so that we have phenomena here that have a huge variability that we also need to take into account. Now, thinking of political science, the next, so it's let's think about this link between science and politics or public policies. Well, we have had several seminars in order to strengthen that connection, that link. So in the face of climate change, how policies can act, because these changes, these climate changes in the future, they can have a real impact on water availability for the different communities that are necessary for the different economic activities in the region. Well, that's all from me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Juan. Let me remind you that you can enter your questions in the chat and we'll be answering them all later. The chat box is at the bottom of your screen. Thank you to all of those who have already entered your questions. So now let's listen to our last presentation today, Federico Robledo. He is a PhD in atmospheric and oceanic sciences by the University of Buenos Aires. He's also a professor there, and he's a researcher of the National Council for Technical and Scientific Research, and he works at the Research Center at the Oceanic and Atmospheric Sciences Institute. Federico, you have the floor. Please go ahead. Hello, thank you. Can you see my presentation? Yes, we can. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this webinar. I'm talking about how to foresee in flash floods and how to include the community in producing hydrometeo knowledge to reduce the risk of disasters. So what is this project about? So I'm going to give you a brief introduction. This is a team effort that brings on board different people, scientists, technicians, experts, not only meteorologists, but also hydrologists, universities, National Hydrology Institute, and it incorporates a number of disciplines. Now, this project is interesting because it's not only a number of people from the scientific community who take part, but rather people who are also living in territories that are very frequently impacted by especially flash flooding. So in this project, we come together and we hold conversations with all these people and territories. We want to be able to discuss the impacts with them. For example, flash flooding. These do not occur, in the case of Argentina, all over the country. Flash flooding occurs very specifically in small areas, in small neighborhoods, in parts of a neighborhood where people live. So what we're trying to achieve with the project is to get into a discussion on how to understand the perspective of the inhabitants, the people who live in those areas. They know how the water moves, which areas are most impacted. And we also want to raise awareness of everyone in the scientific community through this continuous dialogue. I can't get my next slide up on the screen. Here it is. So there are three main questions. Local communities access meteo weather information, do they? And local governments, do they use weather information and climate information in their decision making? And as to the technical scientific sector, do they produce weather and climate information that is accessible and that can be understood by local governments and communities that are exposed to these risks? Those are the three questions. So we're working on a number of territories within Argentina, especially, and I'm going to show you a case study, the basin of Matanza-Riachuelo, very close to the city of Buenos Aires with 5 million inhabitants. It's a half rural basin, half urban basin as well, depending on the location. And they have between 2 and 7 floods a year, and more than or up to 10,000 people are affected by these floods, mostly vulnerable communities. So, and these flash floodings actually affect people over a week, 2 weeks. So we've been working on this since 2013 on this particular basin, and our proposal is to bring together local communities for knowledge sharing and know-how sharing. What's the concept and methodology? I'm not going to go into terrible detail here, but the idea is to co-produce knowledge with local actors. Here, there'll be a dialogue between different disciplines: meteorology, oceanography, hydraulic engineering, computation, or IT, social disciplines like anthropology, hydrology, geography, so that we can enter into an interdisciplinary debate and discussion with local communities and governments, where we see also professionals, teachers, social workers, and thus we can establish a cross-cutting sectoral debate to try to establish a permanent space for debate, to share hydrometeo information, to set up early warning systems with our local communities so that we can eventually reduce the risk. So this is the concept. I'm going to try to show you a map where we identify the risks and how we manage them, how we manage the risk. So this is our flow of information, hydrometeo information. On the vertical axis, you see space, horizontally time, seasonal, subseasonal, 3 to 7 days forecasts, the short-term alert, and then that's just before the flood occurs. On the spatial axis, we have a lot of information here on a national level by our National Weather Institute, also on regional level of basins, local level, and micro level, which means boroughs or neighborhoods. Now, all of these layers give us information, as Sol explained. These are provided by different national agents. These little arrows will show you the flow of information, where the information is received, like in the province of Buenos Aires. And then there's an information flow that really doesn't get to the target audience. In other cases, it does. But from the provincial government, the flow of information goes to the local government. And when we started this process in 2013, we realized that the flow of information was very substandard. Here, the municipality of La Matanza received information. There is very good cooperation between them and the disaster risk agencies, but then we realize that information, hydrological and meteo information, is not going down from national or provincial layers to the local setting and the communities. So we identified 3 questions to try to demonstrate that we do have these 3 deficits in information flow. We do have lack of information in terms of the basin, also in terms of the local community that is impacted, and in terms of the time frame. At the beginning of our project, we weren't working with seasonal or sub-seasonal forecasts, only short-term forecasts between 3 and 7 days. So now we have generated these other channels for information sharing. You can see them here in these finer arrows, and this has allowed us to cover some of these gaps. So the first challenge is communication barriers in terms of spatial scales. Second challenge, to work on timescales and seasonal and sub-seasonal forecasts, all the information produced by the scientific community so that it can get to the local community for decision-making in terms of planning public policies. And thirdly, our third challenge, to break down those communication barriers between when it comes to the actual basins. So for the first challenge, I'll give you a few pictures here. Since 2013, we've been working with secondary and primary schools in these various neighborhoods who are very severely impacted by flooding. We looked to imply and involve youth. We understand that young people are the main asset, the main actor in order to make changes. So in bringing about the cooperation of these young people, schools, school children, young people, this is a fundamental instrument to be able to set up an early alert, an early warning system in the community. Then we set up a number of precipitation measures and sensors with very high resolution so that they could take data, and the data would then be sent to the National Institute for Hydrology and Meteorology. We also started working with a number of social centers here in La Matanza. We set up a number of networks for communication so that hydro and meteo information could flow naturally and appropriately so that it could be understood by all the inhabitants of these territories. In Matanza, in this basin, now they have information on rainfall. They have a meteo station right in the middle of that basin. The population before, they didn't know what the rainfall data were before this project. So after a number of years, now the basin has 7 weather stations and manual rainfall meters to understand how much rainfall was going to be expected. Before, it was impossible to quantify. And now they have all of these sensors that are measuring, and also 4 automatic stations that measure real-time precipitation. So this network was designed together with schools and local networks, and they have a sense of belonging of the data, and therefore they are completely committed and actively taking part in collection of data. Also, we wanted to train professional people at universities, and in 2018, we set up a university course seeking to train people so that they would not only receive the training necessary for their degree in terms of climate, meteo-physical parameters, we also wanted them to acquire the knowledge to be able to set up a dialogue with a community that was affected by floods, so that they would also be able to listen carefully to that community. What do they need? What do they want? And what tools do we have? And what can we do from the scientific community to find concrete solutions for these territories? As to the seasonal and sub-seasonal forecasts, since 2018, we've set up a number of projects involving local governments. We've not only had participation of the local people, but also healthcare workers, social development areas, also technological, environmental workers at the municipality. We tend to have meetings 2 or 3 times a year for regular updates, 3 monthly updates and the interannual forecasts, so that we can give them climate information over the following 12 months. Also legislation, what kind of, well, in fact, in Matanza, an early warning system was approved, and this allowed us to formalize this strategy in terms of getting closer to the community. Finally, at the basin level, in 2020, we also addressed the rural part of the basin, the higher part of the basin, where information is very much lacking, and we really needed to have information on this to understand how it would affect the population. So we found a way to talk to a cooperative of beekeepers in this rural community. You can see pictures here of that meeting, and this allowed us to broaden our project to the rural community and to understand the demands of beekeepers as well in this basin. This sketch here, this shows, well, it symbolizes for us something that I believe is the very aim of this project. On your screen, you can see the threshold, the height of the river. That is, how much does it have to rain in the river, in the basin, so that the river will grow? Now, before our project, we didn't have this type of data. And this need came about because it was called for by local actors, schools, municipalities, social organizations, and so on. They asked, how much does it have to rain for the river to overflow? So thanks to their demands, we were able to take local measurements and construct this diagram. And we wondered, what statistical method would we need to be able to do this? Well, this is a result. You can see the levels of the river, the impact that it generates, and also the precipitation and how it affects the river. And this table here, so simple, was very good to understand, very easy to understand by local and territorial managers. Now, other challenges that lie ahead. Action and reflection in the territory requires dialogue with local people. This allows concrete strategies at local level to mitigate climate change. Also, to give people the know-how in territories, especially young people, also allowed us to generate solutions to address concrete problems. Finally, also important, including community in co-producing knowledge allowed us and allowed everyone to access information and data which is hydrologically and meteorologically official data and not data that is not official. Thank you very much, Federico. So now we've listened to all the presentations today, and now we're going to open the floor for debate so that you can ask questions to presenters. Let us begin with questions for Sol Hurtado. We have Adriana Verra who's asking, what experiences do you have on the territory in terms of Argentina to be able to reach such good conclusions? Natalia Pesa is asking her, were you able to observe or evaluate in the event of risk how people could learn and how that could transcend in terms of the future? Another question for by Ted Scheffer. Could you tell us a little bit more about how scientific knowledge production can diminish the risk? Could you refer to the various examples that we've heard today? And then there are other questions for Juan. So, Anna? I was thinking that perhaps we could give everybody the questions and then go on to answer them. Well, thank you very much for your questions. Thank you for your attention and your kind listening. Perhaps you might need to remind me some of the questions because I need to concentrate on each of them. Anyway, thank you, Adriana, for your question. I know Adriana personally, thanks to the project that Federico just presented. Now, Adriana's question really does pose a challenge. I'm going to try and respond. In anthropology, well, I carried out my research, as I explained, between 2016 and 2019 in two organizations in Argentina, one provincial, one local. Now, given the characteristics of the people who work in anthropology in the field, where we use ethnography as a classical methodology. We use this traditionally in anthropology, and this involves that as researchers, we need to be present somehow in the day-to-day life of our interlocutors, of the people who we are studying, the people who live in those territories and realities that we are trying to understand and research on. This, of course, creates a lot of fondness and trust and closeness, and this brings about another challenge, an ethical challenge, if you like, because we have to safeguard the identity of our interlocutors, in many cases, precisely because they are there in their communities, and because we have this close relationship, we can actually access aspects that are of an intimate nature, and we're working on trust. You discuss things. And had we not been allowed into those social spaces, we would not have a right to be there. So add to that, that we need to think about all of this and then put it on paper, to publish papers so that other people can read about our studies. So this really, well, I can't really explain with whom I worked, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to safeguard the identity of my interlocutor. So that's my response. I worked about a year and a half in a municipal defense service, and for a little over a year, I worked with a provincial defense unit. This is the only national organization available for this, but we did on-site, very on-site visits at the national weather station so that I could understand how some of the forecasts were generated by the National Weather Service. And to wrap up now, the main point, in order to reach some of these reflections or conclusions. I don't like to talk about conclusions because that means like a closed thought, but these are ideas that are continually evolving, especially when we're talking about these exchanges in territories and spaces. We need to keep thinking reflecting. Perhaps the next time that we get together, I might have a different idea or view, and I might change my thoughts. But the important idea is to produce knowledge. And in anthropology, this implies being there for a long time in those social spaces that we're trying to understand. It's not that we just go there, ask a couple of questions, and then go back to our offices to think about all of this in front of our computers. All of that know-how and knowledge is produced through dialogue, by being there, and by being with the people who live in those areas and who we're trying to understand in their day-to-day life. So I'm going to finish that question. Do you wish to continue with questions for Juan, or shall I respond to the next question? Yes, you have time to answer the next question if you like, and then we'll move on to Juan. So the next question, and it was Natalie. I'm going to just recheck the chat to be able to recap the question. Natalia was asking, were you able to observe or assess in the event of a risk, how to manage that risk, and does it transcend, or is it just a reaction of people? Well, thank you, Natalie, for your question. I have a number of points to make. On the one hand, the paradigm which is still predominating in the defense units that we work with in our project, which is multidisciplinary. Julieta, who is the moderator today, also carried out research, a similar piece of research, and this was very good for us to discuss together on our results and findings. Well, the response paradigm is still very much predominant for a number of reasons, and we don't really have time to go into all these reasons. So somehow, yes, we're seeing a behavior based on reaction. However, we are seeing also a transition that is taking place. I would say that perhaps there are two triggers. On the one hand, when major events take place with huge impacts, I'm thinking about flash floodings, a very serious one that produced dozens of dead people a few decades ago in the territory where we were conducting our research. Well, that generated a huge and very clear impact on triggering certain policies. For example, to set up an early warning system at provincial level with the municipal defense unit, where they began to communicate and send the weather forecasts out more systematically in a more orderly fashion. And that certainly generated different responses and also more specific public policies. On the other hand, more slowly, but in a sustainable manner, we also saw a change in paradigm in terms of how there was more clarity. I would say that at least all the national forces that I spoke to better understood how to react to natural disasters. Of course, they had different ways of understanding them, but some had more clarity, others less know-how. But it's a very sustained, slow process. And this explains the change of paradigm. And this is what I try to document in my research. In scientific bibliography and references in the 80s, and as from the 90s, we've seen a change after that with the global action frameworks, and then the national global frameworks. And then we've seen how that has all trickled down into public policies that are very concrete, very specific to defend the population in the face of these threats. So in short, If policies are only reactive, yes, they might be, but we are seeing a transition towards how people are broaching emergencies and natural disasters, especially when institutions are totally overwhelmed by the effects of natural disasters and then require the intervention of other actors. And we're seeing this clearly. We're seeing a transition in very many ways. What I explained in my presentation, that is more training in weather and climate matters so that people have a more clear idea, more dissemination of this knowledge and the daily work of the national forces who have to react. Well, certainly we're seeing a change of paradigm that is clearly having the impact on the policies. And there was another question, I believe, yes?
Yes, there's a question from Ted Shepard. So can you elaborate on how the production of scientific data can actually help you in your endeavors? So, well, from our field work, I can think of different climate and, well, weather products that we generate at the National Weather Service. I can remember one particular instance when I was working for the local level, well, the more down to earth, so to speak, or grassroots uh, government level in Argentina. There was a forecast by the Met Service, and then one was an extended forecast. The other one was a 1 week forecast, and they had different production models, very different. So the different areas, the different agencies at Met Service that had generated them were quite different, and one was an extended forecast for 4 days, I believe, and the other one was a 1 week forecast for high impact events. And then they said completely different things. I don't clearly remember what it was, but it was for in one particular day, on one particular day, one said it was going to be raining very heavily, and the other said it was going to be sunny. And I think it was, I think I remember it was one of the, days for like voluntary firemen or fire squad members or whatever. So they were preparing different festivities and events. And so this contradictory information it resulted in some volunteer firemen having to go, and they had really it rained on their parade. Actually, I mean they were on their own because they had gone out, and it was really raining cats and dogs. So, well, um, this is really something related to the uncertainty linked to these products and the different forecasts you can make depending on the models you use. Then predictability when trying to issue a weather warning in some areas, for instance, the in the territory. Well, the warning arrives very late. Almost they are not actionable at all. But many civil protection services organize their work according to those warnings. So if they don't receive the warning on time, they consider that everything is going to be all right. So if the warning reaches them quite late or a bit late, well, that is going to generate trouble because the civil services, the civil protection services consider, well, they just suppose or imagine that there is, if they don't get an alert or a warning, then nothing untoward is going to happen. And well, there would be many more examples, but just this is just an example. The weather warnings. it's not a substantive element regarding risk, but I think it's quite representative of the whole idea. Yes. Well, thank you very much, Sol. And well, now I have here the first two questions for Juan. Let me read them out so we can have time for all speakers to answer questions. How did you calculate the drought threat map, and what is the time validity for those? And then the space and time variability, would that improve if there were more weather stations? These are the two questions I have for you from Florencia and Mario. Well, let me begin with the last one from Florencia. Well, we have some 800 kilometers of, long Andean ridge. That's we only have 5 stations to monitor for an ongoing monitoring of snow, of the snow cover. And snow is actually the first and foremost trigger, and the lack of it, of course, of drought, hydrological drought in the region. So it would be absolutely essential to improve monitoring and the availability of hydromet information, because if we want to quantify a risk, we need to quantify the dangers that are associated to it. And the only way to measure that is by means of information. I mean, by having met information, weather information. So regarding Mario's question about how we created this drought map, well, we based ourselves on a scientific study. So starting from the severity levels, you can see moderate drought, intense drought, and extreme drought. So you attribute some weight to the different categories. So since 2010 until now, how many months of moderate drought? And I give it a unit weight for those. Then I quantify how many months I had a severe drought, and then I would multiply those amounts by 2. And if it's extreme drought, I multiply them by 3. So I focus more on the periods where the deficit was higher, was the highest. So if I add those categories up, then I can build up an indicator that tells me for each basin, for each river, which are the different threat levels. So a higher indicator will tell me that well, there was a longer time persistence of severe or extreme events, whereas another would give me as a result that there were lower or less severe or moderate droughts in certain periods. So that particular map we did for the recent drought periods. We could extend that in time. We have ongoing registers and records for very many different stations in the region, so we could extend that and geographically as well. Vulnerability indicators come from censuses. Basically, we had a census or a population or poll or a census last year in Argentina, so we still need time to process that information, those data, and to see which are going to be the indicators that would let us, I mean, the vulnerability indicators that would let us know more and have a better idea, better grasp of what a hydrological drought is. So let's move on to the next question. It's the questions for Fede, if you agree. Yes. Yeah, for Fede, we have a comment from Adriana Berra. Says it's an extremely important work in our territory. For Federico Robledo's presentation, this is a project that is really going to do wonders for the Matancera community who's suffering the results of these flash floods. And then yet again for the first speakers. So how do you think that you can improve your seasonal forecast? Because in CISA, we are developing products for seasonal forecast with different thresholds and also sub-seasonal in order to. Do you think that that would also be helpful for La Matanza? That's for the last speaker. Well, I had two things to say about the first question, but then Caro, with a second proposal, has already started to reply to the first question. To do use the three terciles in 2018, between Christmas and the New Year, we created this community committee because we were really worried about flash floods. And when we showed the quarterly forecast from the Met Service, the first question that we were asked on that particular task force, that were people from the health services, social services, civil protection. So the first question they asked, what is the standard for La Matanza? So what is above normal? What is above standard or below standard, below normal? So we really didn't know, and we had to admit that in our minds we were thinking about the terciles, but so what is a normal or a regular standard summer for La Matanza? The different percentiles, 66, 63, but we hadn't really made that, we hadn't really found that out. It was a very simple question, we couldn't answer it. So this is why we went back, we did the field work, and now we know what the standard figures are for each month and for each quarter. So that helped us a lot. Now, what standards? Well, we need to consider the percentiles, and we are doing this for the rainfall, for precipitation for 4 days to see whether we can make forecasts which are seasonal or sub-seasonal. Well, we did that. We did that at the time. What Carol is saying. So, to the three terciles that we use regularly to define impact, to actually do away with that is essential. Now we need to define what's normal, what's the percentiles that you need to use, the terciles that you need to use in each case. That's the only way to actually create those seasonal, sub-seasonal forecasts. We need to have a range of thresholds. This territory, we have had flash floods with 60 millimeters rainfall. That's in the autumn, in the spring, with only 60 millimeters of precipitation. You have flash floods because the soil is so dry. So, in the summer, on the other hand, we've had much higher precipitation, and we did not have flash floods. In the last few months, for instance, during last autumn, it was very dry, a dry spell. And then we had 1 week where we went over 190 millimeters in just 1 week. So what was the conclusion from the territorial authorities is that they did not have flash floods, and that there were not flash floods because the soil was so dry, that the ground acted almost like a sponge. It actually sucked up all that water, and that was the conclusions that they reached in the secondary school and the primary schools as well. And then so that's why you need to have the territorial knowledge. And then to Carolina's second question, if you're trying to work together with a territorial actor, you cannot never separate forecasting from monitoring. In this, what happened in May, it had really to do with the fact that there had been no rainfall, almost no rainfall at all during the previous months. If it had been a regular summer, then we would have had flash floods. So we can never um, create a separation between monitoring and forecasting. You need to teach that, how to do that to the territorial authorities. I don't know exactly how to do it. We have some experiences, but monitoring either daily, weekly, monthly, it's essential in order to be able to forecast. And then we ourselves, we need to dialogue, we need to speak and to discuss things with them, with the territorial authorities, not keep everything to ourselves with ADINA, with the with academia and with the technical staff. No, we need to work together with the local people. Well, thank you. Thank you ever so much, Fede. There is a question from Walter de Benedictis in the chat saying, so what are the financial resources you have to carry out your research? I think they come from different research, academic research projects. Is that the case in both, in your three cases? No, just a clarification regarding financing and funding. In our case, to anticipating flash floods, this comes from the Ministry of Science, or funding comes from the Ministry of Science, and what they want, the program is called Have an Impact, and they want to discuss, to receive requests from the different territories. They are sent to the Ministry of Science, and then the Ministry of Science looks for the ideal people to reply to that question. And it's a different way. It's the approach. It's the other way around. Usually we researchers, we generate the questions, but now it's the territory, is the grassroots who generate the questions, and they ask us to find the answer. So the ministry tells them, ask the local governments and territorial governments, what are your issues? What are your questions? And they look for someone who has tries and find the answer. So the answers that we are generating come directly from specific answers from the local authorities. Flor, we have a question from Flor. She wanted to ask Sol and Juan, considering differences in cases, is it possible to have a dialogue between the two ways to approach risk, to address risk? And please be very brief because we're about I mean, our time is running up. So are the two approaches compatible? Well, let me evade your question. No, okay, let me, I think that's a challenge that we have to address. We have to reply to that challenge. We have to, this is why we decided to organize these webinars, and this is why we are conducting this dialogue precisely. Well, as like Saul said, that's exactly what's joining us together here, because we want to improve knowledge and the knowledge sharing and its implementation from the social and technical point of view. Well, I'd like to thank everyone to participate, for having participated in the program. Thanks to the different speakers, to the technical staff, the WMO, and let me share these new again our first slide. I'd like to invite you to the next webinars on the 26th of July. It's climate stories or climate storylines. You will be receiving some invites so you can enroll and register for the seminar. Please join us. And thank you very much to all of you for being here.